So we look in the case of State versus Rose at a question of causation. And I really find this to be one of the more interesting questions that we'll look at the entire semester. This is a homicide case. So because it's homicide, there is one more component to this crime than in the initial formula we gave you, that Professor Mystic gave you: actus reus plus mens rea equals crime. If we were just looking at assault, then hitting this victim plus being potentially reckless about it, would equal a crime of assault. But because this is a homicide, we have actus reus plus mens rea plus harm, and that harm is obviously death for a homicide case. So the question is, when you have harm, is it the defendant's criminal action that caused this? So obviously, the victim in this case died because of impact with the victim's car, or with the defendant's car. There's no question about that. But you have to get inside of the facts of this case to figure out why this matters. So, as you know, in this case, State versus Rose, the poor pedestrian steps out into traffic and is struck by Rose's car. Rose then drives another 600 feet with the body dragging under the undercarriage of the car. The coroner is not able to say whether the initial impact killed the victim or whether the dragging of the body under the car was what actually caused the death. Why does this matter? And the court obviously goes through the analysis and finds that it has to reverse the manslaughter conviction because one version of the death implicates the criminal response, or is caused by the criminal responsibility of the driver, Rose, and the other was an accident. Or at least all the facts here reveal the court assumes the other version of death was an accident. What do we mean by that? Well, what you have to get out of this case when you read it is that if the victim died on impact, that the court is implicitly saying that that was an accident, that the state had presented insufficient proof that Rose was criminally liable for that initial impact. But what is he criminally liable for? Not stopping. If he had stopped at impact and found that the victim was dead, the court seems to implicitly be saying that wouldn't be a homicide crime. But because he drives another 600 feet and the victim ends up dead, if the dragging was what actually caused the death, then he did clearly do something wrong. Even if the initial impact is an accident, you're supposed to stop immediately when you hit someone, not pull them under your car until you can find a nice parking space and do as the defendant Rose did in this case, get out of the vicinity and go try to establish an alibi. So the question in this case is, when did the death actually occur? If it happened at impact, the court's assuming that was an accident. If it happened from the dragging, the court is equally assuming that that's something for which the defendant bore responsibility, that it is at least a reckless act to drag a body under your car for 600 feet. And so the court here ends up concluding that there's insufficient evidence of the time of death, of which act, the impact or the dragging, caused the death, and therefore, beyond a reasonable doubt, we are missing one of the elements of the crime. We're missing a showing that the defendant's act caused the harm. More precise, that the defendant's criminal act, that the defendant's recklessness caused the death. Because it could be that the initial impact, for which the court's assuming was an accident, could have been the cause of the death. This is why I find this case so very fascinating. No matter when that victim died, Rose made an accidental initial contact with the victim with his car, and not knowing whether the victim was alive or dead, drove that body dragging under the car for 600 feet. Those facts are not in dispute. And it's fascinating that the way Rose will be punished is radically different if the victim had a couple of beats left in his heart when the dragging started. Think about how weird that is. And this is the type of thing that the model penal code will attempt, and states following the model penal code's model will try to reconcile. He might be punished for, he will be punished for leaving the scene of an accident. If, when this case goes back down, because we couldn't show when the actual crime occurred or when the death actually occurred. But Henry Rose is the same person regardless of when the victim's heart stopped beating. He still hit someone accidentally and continued to drive knowing that body was dragging under his car, not knowing whether it was alive or dead as he drugged the body another 600 feet. So this case really does show the common law's very strict emphasis on harm. Was it the criminal act of Henry Rose that caused this death? Now, as we look at some of the statutes that are inspired by the model penal code, we'll see that crimes that are malicious, that are motivated by poor will be punished in and of themselves because of the bad act. And they'll be punished very severely because of the bad act, not necessarily because of the harm that they caused or didn't occur or didn't cause. The Rose case is a classic example of making harm the primary driver of how we punish, to use a bad metaphor, of how we punish, because we're looking solely at whether the victim died on impact from the accident or from the dragging. We're not looking at the fact that Henry Rose was indifferent to the possibility that he could be snuffing out a life as he continued to drag that body under the car. This really shows you, in my mind, the problem of focusing our criminal punishment on harm rather than on the nature of the actor. Henry Rose is the same guy either way. We will talk more when we get to attempts about this type of question, but this lays out for you when there is harm that's required, the defendant's criminal action has to be the cause of that harm. And here, the court says we couldn't determine whether the defendant's accidental action or the defendant's criminal action was the cause of the death, and therefore, Henry Rose will not be convicted of manslaughter.